recognize our extraordinary cultural comfort with inequality and injustice. And I think that at the most fundamental. But in terms of policy and access, as you very rightly said, let me talk about three things. Food, since Vandana will also be speaking about food, I'll speak less about. But I do think that universal access to food is something, and farmers' rights and so on. So I think universal access to the right to food is something that in the UPA government a law was passed. We have to think more deeply about how we make that happen. The second thing that I would really like to talk about is labor rights. That you have to, we cannot live in a country any longer where 9 out of 10 workers actually survive with no labor protection whatsoever. And it came through in many different ways. But I was working on a paper with Joyati, who will be speaking, and Prabhat Patnaik, and we were talking about what needed to be done. And one of the things we said was that just like the middle class was assured their salaries through the period of the lockdown, every person should have got at least the equivalent to minimum wages. And we calculated about 7,000 rupees per household across the country. It was something that would cost about 2% of GDP, and we felt it must be done. But in a practical way, in rural areas, thanks to NREGA, we at least have a list of workers. But in urban areas, we actually have no list whatsoever because the state is offering, they're not registered, there's no question of any protection. And finally, Prabhat actually said the only way we can do it is actually like during an election, that people would have to come and you put indelible ink on one finger and give them the cash this month. Next month, we put it on another. I mean, we have to have an assurance of full labor rights, labor protection, and the government has gone in the opposite direction of reducing even whatever labor protections we have. So that's the second, and the last is public health, universal public health, and I think that is above all what we need to learn. Uh, what we need to learn from this whole crisis is that private healthcare, for-profit private healthcare, can never take care of the poor, and we must have universal healthcare. We have to spend at least 3% of our GDP and focus most of all on primary healthcare, on preventive healthcare, and on healthcare in secondary centers in the district. So these were three uh, my three sort of what we must do as the highest priority.
Yeah, but you see, a very we may talk about equal access when it comes to food, health, infrastructure, and all of that. But all of that really depends on how we've dealt with our distribution of resources in the past and where have we ended up with those policies. And I know that Dr. Shiva could come in on that, that equal distribution of resources has been a challenge for this country given our demography, our population, our policies. Would you like to talk a bit about that? And many people feel that there may not be a complete monopoly on the health sector, but uh, the the better quality of health services are in one sense in the hands of very few, which is a serious problem for access. If Dr. Shiva could speak a bit on that.
I think part of the problem is we are literally looking at the tail and imagining it's wagging the dog. Access comes after production, and production systems must produce more. Production and distribution was made totally separate, but how you produce decides what you'll produce and who gets it. So the work I've done in Navdanya shows that the more diverse your food system, the more seed sovereign and food sovereign and land sovereign and water sovereign your farmers, the more food they grow, food as nourishment. The more your dependence on external inputs, the more commodities you grow. And the experience of the pandemic is so clear. You know, I smile to myself that since 1991, when the World Bank said, don't grow grain, why is India growing grain? Grow tomatoes and onions and potatoes, the pot package. Well, they've come out with a new doubling farm income policy saying, stop growing low value grain, grow high value crops. But a tomato is not a high value or low value crop independently. If everyone grew tomatoes and there was no one to take it, you're going to have a very low value, zero value crop, which is what happened in the pandemic. I got calls from our farmers saying, because we are growing food, because we have gardens, the women were calling and saying, we have food in our village. Whereas those who were growing cash crop commodities are waiting for a buyer, and the supply lines have collapsed. So we are living in a period of vulnerability, and these long distance chain is what has got aggravated with the three ordinances. And I do ask the professional Congress to look into it, to prevent these ordinances from becoming law, to do what it needs before and what it needs to be done after in Parliament, other things. So our work has shown that ecological systems produce more, and we can have enough food for 2 times India's population. Good, nourishing food. But then we've changed the centralized systems of distribution and prevent the centralization in the hands of a few. We are talking of a global food system whose door has been totally opened by these ordinances. We're talking about 8 players. We're talking about four sellers of poison who control the seed. We're talking about 4 grain traders. We're talking about 2 retail giants who've become e-commerce giants. And we are talking about 3 processors. Let me give you the cost and access issue. So they've said, you know what they're calling? The exploiter is being renamed the sponsor in these laws. So a Pepsi locked farmers in Bengal into growing potato, and UP, all over the country. The farmer sells, and Pepsi makes a 20 rupee package. You know how much the farmer got out of that? 0.04. Pepsi has been given total freedom to buy raw material at nothing. Food is being changed into raw material. That's the threshold where we are. Food will no more be food. Okay, what happened? Yeah, I'm wrapping up. I think the 3 things we need to reclaim is self-governance for the small and the poor and the village. That's why we had Swaraj and Panchayati Raj. But regulation of the extractor, exploiter, the big giants. What's happening is the corporations are being deregulated and the people are being policed. This is an inverted pyramid. I agree with Harsh. We've got to strengthen environmental rights, labor rights, farmers' rights, and the rights of those without work. And in fact, the people coming home gives us a new opportunity to change the paradigm of how we run the rural economy, to grow everything we need, to create livelihoods of multiple kinds. That is the work. Conserving resources, creating more work, and providing good needs. Access to junk food is an access to disease. It is not an access at all.
Thank you, Dr. Shiva. Now, before we take some questions from our participants across the country, I just want to ask that what is the one positive lesson that COVID has taught us, and what are the 3 basic things you would like to see governments do from here on? If you could both, address that, and then I'll go straight into questions. What is the one, the most important lesson, if you like, we've learned from COVID? And what are the 3 things that you feel is an absolutely mandatory thing for any government to do in the post-COVID period? If both of you address that, I'll take the questions after that.
Yeah, so Sushmita, I think the biggest lesson from COVID is, if anything is going to help us get past this pandemic and any future humanitarian crisis like this, it is solidarity. It is our ability to think that we are together, rich and poor, working class and the entrepreneurs, men and women, rural, urban, Muslim, Hindu, etc. All of these divisions don't matter. We are together. What is called fraternity in Hindi, the constitution uses the word bandhuta, the idea that we are bound to and with each other. I think above all, we need to reclaim a social contract which is built on the idea of solidarity. And this is not a complicated, this is not an ephemeral idea. It is actually without the idea that if my, if I'm asked to stay at home and feel safe in a lockdown, I need to worry about those who don't have homes to stay in, or there are 10 people living in a shanty without running water. What is going to happen to them? I think this idea of our shared destinies is at the heart of what we talk about. The three things that I've also already mentioned, but I'll emphasize: universal public funded healthcare, universal social protection for all workers, labor rights, and as long as large segment of our workers are in the informal sector, you cannot talk about employers being responsible for their social protection. It has to be the state. So state funded social protection, universal social protection, state funded public health care, uh, and the third, and it might sound odd over here, is actually a restoration of the idea of a secular democracy, the strengthening of the idea of a secular democracy. These are the three that I would stress most on. But Vandana, I
Thank
think
you, Harsh. I think Dr. Shiva, if you could quickly address those
Quickly,
questions.
very, very quickly. I notice we are running out of time. I think the lessons, two lessons that have been learned by the pandemic is one: long distance supply chains were totally vulnerable, and therefore local economies is the future. This is what our freedom fighters and our Swadeshi vision was. And let me just quote a 1947 speech of Gandhi, where he said, "The first lesson we must learn is of self-help and self-reliance, true self-reliance. If we assimilated this lesson, we shall at once free ourselves from disastrous dependence on foreign countries and ultimate bankruptcy." This is not said in arrogance, but as a matter of fact. We are not a small place. We are a subcontinent. We are a country of mighty rivers and a rich variety of agricultural land. And my research has shown, they will measure one commodities in one season and say they produce more. Bengal, 4 seasons, multiple produce. Our productivity analysis has shown that we have to give up for the future the pseudo productivity created by colonialism to match extractivism and to drive a fossil fuel age. That age is going to be over. We have to shift to true efficiency, ecological efficiency, and we have to regenerate our resources. We watched the migrants go home while we are watching refugees of the floods. We had made a connection in Chipko 50 years ago that the forests are connected to water regulation. Deforestation means flooding and droughts. We have been trying to dismantle our environment impact assessment and therefore the process of regulation for the environment for more floods. And no one is looking. This is something that must be done. You can no longer separate the ecological crisis, the agrarian crisis, the food and health crisis, and the employment crisis. And finally, I think we have to get back to the principles of diversity and decentralization on which our civilization is built, on which post-independent India is built, and that the world desperately needs. I am doing a civilizational dialogue series with people from different fields in science and technology on the fact that the world needs this thinking at a time where the mechanistic mind is absolutely creating havoc after havoc after havoc. And then they're talking about leaving our bodies to enter the machine. Google is talking about we have to defeat Mother Nature. Just read the literature of these tech giants and the imagination by which they're fired. We can't have the future left in their hands to create a surveillance capitalism. We have to create true freedom.
To take some questions which have been sent to me. One question is from Subhash Babu from Bangalore. And essentially, I think what he's asking is, while we talk about distribution of resources and access to healthcare, etc. What the COVID has also exposed is the distribution of power between the center and the state. It's under severe challenge. We realize the lacuna. So, Harsh, what he's asking is, would you like to say something on that? That's an important aspect. I guess it impacts society too.
Yeah, I think that we saw a process of decision making which is entirely centralized. I mean, uh, who advised the prime minister before he decided to go in for the biggest lockdown in the world and 4 hours notice? It's very unclear. He clearly didn't consult with even his cabinet colleagues. He certainly didn't consult with the chief ministers, and I think that the disaster that we and the crisis that we are facing could have been averted if there had been a greater respect of India's federal character. And we also have seen that it is states like Kerala, or even more locally, Dharavi. Dharavi is a wonderful example of where, in a very localized kind of place. I mean, I had feared that the worst, deaths would be in a place like Dharavi, which is one of the most crowded places in the world, and yet because they decentralized decision making. So I think COVID is a reminder of also the importance of truly implementing decentralized and federal governance.
Thank you, Harsh. There's a question for Dr. Shiva. Someone is asking, what are these ordinances and how does it impact the farmers? So I think some of the participants may not have read it. So if you could just enlighten them.
So the first is the Essential Commodities Amendment Ordinance, getting rid of regulation of prices, which in the area of food means return to famine. The Farmers' Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Ordinance. And yeah, we did need a little less restrictions on farmers on the mandi laws, but that doesn't mean handing everything over to Amazon. This is handing over to Amazon and Pepsi. And then the third is Farmers Empowerment Protection and Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Ordinance, which is basically a contract law. This is where they have named the exploitative corporations which give 1% of the consumer price to farmers. All the research in the world and the research I've done on Indian exploitation shows 1% economy. They're calling them sponsors. And basically the state is stepping out of preventing exploitation of our vulnerable farmers who are already in crisis. That's why I say, if we want to have an India that's food sovereign, we'll have to stop these ordinances, rewrite them, and write true policies. But also, I don't think we should keep waiting. I think the state should do what's in their power right now in order to make sure that the implications of these policies are not, I mean, I think states, agriculture was a state subject. They should just ban contract farming unless the big giants are kept out. And frankly, we have systems of agreements which have worked forever. These contracts are for the big giants. I haven't turned to agriculture and food for fun. I'm having fun in it, but I went into it because I saw the exploitation and the roots of the crisis. And now I see every day I get a mail from Amazon about ordering my groceries from Amazon. No, I'll take it from a Teliwala. We are at a watershed. And the only difference between the East India Company and this is the players are new and the technologies are new, but the processes are old. So I think Shashi's book is still very timely, and we need an essay from Sashi on how, on what the current era of darkness could look like, but what avoiding it could look like.
Thank you, Dr. Shiva. I take the liberty to ask one question myself. I hope the chairman, Dr. Tharoor, doesn't mind. Um, I'd like to say that what's important in a democratic society is transparency. It's absolutely vital in any democracy. So I think this will be the last question because we have to end in the next 3 minutes. So I like Harsh and Dr. Shiva both to answer it. That what do you think, that it's a leading question, but do you think that COVID-19 has put into question, into serious questions, transparency vis-a-vis the government, whether it comes to expenditure, whether it comes to figures of COVID, whether it comes to access of information, and uh, without politicizing it, how does it actually impact the fight against COVID? If we, this would be the last question, if both of you could answer that. Thank you.
Sushmita, I don't think there's ever been a time when we distrust what government tells us more than now. We can't trust their figures on infections and deaths. We simply cannot trust their figures on employment and unemployment, on hunger and so much else. They have on growth, on the state of the economy. So I think that it's a reminder of how critical uh, transparent governance. And in the contrast with the countries which have done best, mostly led by women leaders, actually, it's quite remarkable. New Zealand, Germany, Finland, uh, so many others, Denmark, all led by women leaders. One of the hallmarks has been open communication, transparency. They share every
Absolutely.
fact, they explained everything. And I think that we have the absolute reverse of this very harsh masculinist kind of idea of of one person deciding everything and knowing best and not needing to explain, not accepting any kind of dissent. And the era of darkness, that's the last thing I wanted to say, that Vandana spoke about. I think we're going through the darkest phase of democracy in the country today. And democracy is curtailed in many different ways. People are frightened about dissenting, because if you're dissenting, people are being thrown into jail. The way we are
Yeah.
responding to things like pandemics, but also you're absolutely right about we're not being informed. Nobody is explaining to us why decisions are being taken. Why was there a night curfew? Why has the night curfew? Was there suddenly some data about virus is suddenly becoming very active at night? Please let us know why you had a night curfew in a health emergency. Nobody explains.
Yeah, true. Dr. Shiva, would you like to address that?
We're going through a very Orwellian redefinition of transparency. While the
Hmm.
top becomes totally opaque, we are all being watched every minute. And that's why I
Hmm.
keep trying to bring up the fact that the issue is we are on the verge of a new surveillance state and a new surveillance globally organized capital. And someone said, no, who instructed? Well, Mr. Gates is instructed. He has mentioned he's instructed how this pandemic will be managed. And I don't think we should be ignoring how this man and the billionaires function. I noticed there's a question, why shouldn't farmers be totally free? Of course, we want them to be free. That's why we don't then want them locked in to new chains that are invisible. We don't want people locked into new chains. We don't want slavery revisited in a sophisticated form. The exploration and defense of freedom in this age is a new challenge. And we need to undertake it with full awareness of all the factors at play.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the panel discussion, and I think everybody did. There were a lot of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't, raise them with our panelists. And I think um, since Harsh Mandar is here, I would end on the note saying that uh, what hurts me is so many arrests have taken place, so many dissenting voices have been crushed. But as you know, what happened in JNU, till today, there's been no arrest.
Yeah.
And that speaks volumes to me, because the law must treat everybody equally. And it's just uh, COVID has only magnified, I think, what is to come for the rest of the 4 years, and what unfolded in the last 6 years. I thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, It's always a pleasure to share any platform with you. And congratulations to the entire AIPC team, and more power to you. And see you all soon again on another panel.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
Sushmita, for leading this effort. You moderated it brilliantly, and I'm so grateful for our outstanding panelists, Harsh Mandar and Dr. Vandana Shiva. Vandana, you were gracious enough to mention my book, An Era of Darkness, and to invite me to write a new book about the current era of darkness. I have done so. It's coming out in November. It's called The Battle of Belonging, and it explores our current reality through the larger conceptual and practical debates over nationalism, what it means and how it works. So I hope you will both enjoy it. Let me take the opportunity to commend to everybody your books and Harsh Mandar's. Harsh's work on whether our middle class is perhaps the most callous and indifferent to human suffering of all in the world really came back to haunt me during the migrant workers crisis, because it was a reminder of the fact that so many of us as a collectivity appear to have left our hearts somewhere behind, and that clearly is going to have long-term meaning for the value of our souls. Let me once again thank Sushmita Dev as the moderator, Vandana Shiva, Harsh Manda for an outstanding discussion. We're going to take a short break. Those who wish to stay stay connected are welcome to stay connected, and we will at 3 o'clock sharp return to a webinar on the economy, as we have had this webinar on society. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. To our previous panelists, you're more than welcome to stay on and watch. Up next, we have Professor Ghatak, Professor Ghosh, in a conversation moderated by Salman Soz, our Deputy Chairman. This is on a post-COVID India economics. We will begin in exactly 11 minutes from now. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you haven't already, do sign up and join the AIPC. Like last time, if you have a question that you'd like to ask any of our panelists, please put it in the Zoom chat box and we'll escalate it to our moderator. Once again, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We will reconvene in 10 minutes. You can stay on. It's the same Zoom link for the whole day. Thank you so much.
I'm Shashi Tharoor. I too have been a professional and I'm now in politics, but there aren't enough of us who make that transition. So many people in our country have abdicated the world of politics, feeling that professionals need to study hard, pass their exams, do their jobs, pay their taxes, and leave politics to others. Our country to benefit from the skills, the awareness, the expertise that professionals can contribute to our country's governance, then we need to see professionals in politics too. I am delighted that the Congress Party has decided to create a professionals Congress to give professionals a platform and a forum in which they can develop and engage their political interests. The purpose of the Professionals Congress is to allow professionals a way into the Congress Party's deliberative, to give them an opportunity to discuss issues that matter to them, to network with like-minded professionals of the same sort of inclinations, to conduct monitoring of government programs in their areas, to articulate policy suggestions, and to also do their own outreach programs in their areas. A sort of political Rotary Club, as it were, for like-minded professionals from around India. The Professionals Congress is intended to be your home. If you are interested, sign up on this site and let us have your support. Join the Professionals Congress. Jai Hind, Jai Congress.
Professor Ghatak, Salmanji.
Hi there.
How are you, sir? Thank you so much for joining us today. We are live on YouTube and all the AIPC social media platforms currently. I just wanted to check if Professor Ghosh is here with us as well. Right, so our team will connect with her and get her to join. Salmanji, are you there?
I'm here, Alim.
Alim, Professor Ghosh just joined. Okay, I'm promoting her.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, Salmanji, thank you. I just want to quickly run through what's going to happen next. We'll be starting live at 3 o'clock. As of now, we have a few things that we need to just discuss. Number one, we will have a 35 to 30-minute conversation between the three panelists. We will then have 10 to 15 minutes of questions to finish between 3:45 and 3:50 latest. Anyone who'd like to ask a question can share those questions in the Zoom chat box here, and we will escalate that to Salmanji, our moderator. This session will be recorded, and also our policy coordinator, Mr. Amitabh Dubey, will be live tweeting any quote-worthy tweets. So if you haven't already, please do follow AIPC on social media and Amitabh Dubey as well. Thank you very much. Salmanji, we can begin in 5 minutes. Well, 4 minutes now, at which point Alok, our tech czar, will begin the recording. Thank you.
And when they start, Salman, I'll just introduce you and then hand over to you, and then I'll be muted. You run the discussion. So just to say hello to Professor Ghatak and to Jayati Ghosh. I haven't met Jayati in a very long time, but hello to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us and doing this. I'll just more or less say the same thing in a sentence, and then hand over to you, Salman, and then retreat.
I'm actually pleased to let you know that while this conversation was going on, we've launched our new AIPC website. It's a brand new website. It's the 4th version. So if you would like to join us, if you're not a fellow already of the AIPC, www.profcongress.com. We've made the process even simpler to become a fellow of the AIPC. Thank you.
So Professor Ghatak, where are you joining us from?
London. I've been stuck here for a while.
I see. And you're presumably not in, are you offering online classes and so on, or are you just?
We looks like in the coming term, like starting fall, most of it'll be online. So I wasn't teaching the last term, so most of things happened online. So yes, I think at least in the conceivable future, except for small tutorials, I think they are going to be face to face. But even there, the
Mask
sausage
to mask.
exactly, mask to mask, and how people are going to transport themselves to central London, there are a lot of uncertainties.
Right.
And
Well,
how
this
about
is our
you?
most. I'm locked down in Delhi at the moment, but
Okay.
spending a lot of my mind space on Kerala because of the various issues related to the current situation, dealing
Right.
with my constituency and people from my state who seem to be stranded in the most astonishing places around the world. So, even today I had my nth conversation with the civil aviation minister. He and the foreign minister have really been quite invaluable, even though obviously there are political issues amongst us when it comes to saving Indian citizens and bringing them back home. Everyone is pretty much of the same mind, so we're able to get a few things done.
That's good to know. That's good to hear.
Jayati, where are you? For some reason, I'm not seeing.
Oh, I'm also very much here in Delhi.
There you are. Great. Hi, Jay.
Lockdown. Hi, Maitri. Seeing you after a very long time also.
It has been a long time.
I was just thinking, Shashi, when you were saying this, I wish they had the same empathy for the Indians stranded across the country.
I agree. And we've been saying this publicly, as you know.
Yes.
In fact, the previous session on Indian society was, I thought, a very good discussion with Harshmanda.
Yes, I heard a bit of that. Yes.
Sushmita,
yeah.
Where this was one of the themes that emerged very strongly. I think you'll find that professionals have really been conscientized, if one can use that boring word, by this tragic experience that we've all seen, particularly the migrant workers and the working people generally. Okay, Alim, so is it time for me to just, are we going live? Is it time for me to...
Yes, sir. Alok, if you could please begin recording. Perfect. We're recording and we're live.
Great. Well, I'm Shashi Tharoor, Chairman of the All India Professionals Congress, and it's been a very great pleasure for me to participate in this third anniversary conclave in which we are getting together a number of the finest professional minds in India or relating to India to discuss some of the burning issues of our times. We've just concluded the first of our webinars, our discussion on society with Vandana Shiva and of course Harshmanda, both of whose work I'm sure is familiar to many of you, moderated by the chairman of the All India Mahila Congress, Sushmita Dev. We're now going to go into a discussion on the economy. I'm very proud to welcome, to chair and moderate this session, my deputy chair of the All India Professionals Congress, Salman Soz. Salman is no mean economist himself. He's published a couple of very impressive books looking at different angles of the Indian economy. And I think that he could have been a panelist himself, except that we roped him in to actually getting the best out of our two illustrious and very distinguished scholars, Jayati Ghosh and Maitri Ghatak. Both are well-known professors, both are well-known public policy commentators, and both, of course, are passionately committed to seeing a better India. So let me hand you all over now to Salman Soz. I'm backing off and leaving the discussion to these three fine, economically gifted minds. Salman, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shashi. Thank you so much. Welcome all. Congratulations, AIPC, for 3 years. Welcome, Professor Ghosh and Professor Ghatak. Now, this is obviously a very, very important topic, very germane to what's going on in our lives. Let me introduce Professor Ghosh. I mean, she doesn't need much of an introduction. She is the chairperson of the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's one of India's foremost economists, and her areas of specialization are international economics and employment patterns in developing countries and macroeconomic policy. and also gender and development. These are very, very key issues in economic development. Professor Maitrij Ghatak comes to us from the London School of Economics, where he is a professor and also director of the Development Economics Program. So I think we'll have both an internal and an external kind of view on what's going on in not just the Indian economy, but the global economy. So if I can just straight away go to you, Professor Ghosh, and what does the global economic picture look like right now? And then we can come to the Indian story. But what are people seeing globally right now?
Well, globally, it's actually quite a shocking position. It hasn't been like this since the Great Depression, and people are actually worried that it might end up being worse than the Great Depression. So we are in, I think the word unprecedented has been overused, but it's actually the case. We're in unprecedented times. I think there are a couple of disparities in the global economy that are worth noting. First is that East Asia, particularly China, obviously, it's doing its own trajectory. It has its own problems and it has major concerns. It will no longer be something that shores up the rest of the developing world for sure, but it will not be as badly affected as many other places. In the developed world, we have seen obviously massive declines in both output and activity and employment, but we've also seen very, very aggressive response. Fiscal responses are of a level that were not seen even after the global financial crisis. In some countries, they have exceeded, again, even the New Deal levels, at least for this immediate period. We don't know how long that will last. So there's been a very substantial fiscal response. There's been, as usual, everything in the kitchen sink thrown in terms of monetary policy. But it hasn't really had the same impact that you would expect given the size of the stimuli. And that has to do with the peculiar nature of this pandemic, that it hits both demand and supply, and that you can't really have people out there working and doing the kinds of things they would be doing otherwise. In the developing world, mostly we've had very poor fiscal response, even in relation to the global financial crisis, at less than half of the kinds of fiscal stimuli that we saw immediately after that. And even the monetary stimuli have been much more muted, but also they would have less of an impact precisely for the reasons that I mentioned. Also, in large parts of the developing world, like India, the pandemic is still playing out. And so we really have no idea about, the conventional policies are therefore necessarily limited. So the outlook is actually extremely bleak.
Well, yeah, it does seem quite bleak, but let's get to Professor Ghatak. On the same lines, I mean, are you seeing, what is the efficacy of some of the policies that are being used across the world on mitigating this crisis? And how do you see the evolution? And by the way, there is all this talk of there's going to be a V-shaped recovery, which basically means that the economy has a sharp decline and then has a sharp recovery, whereas others feel that maybe this is going to be a U-shaped recovery. Some are saying that it's going to be an L-shaped recovery, which is a long, long process. What do you see, Professor Ghatak?
So before we get into the particular alphabet of the curves that might be charting the recovery course, I just want to thank Dr. Soos and Dr. Tharoor for inviting me to this panel. And of course, Professor Ghosh and I go back a long time. It's nice to be in the same platform. So I think that, and also I should point out that my last name is Ghatak, which comes from the word Ghatna. Ghatak is a nice way of saying it, but it also has a slightly killer side to it. Some settings may be pretty cool to have, but it's really Ghatak. But now coming to more.
If I can interrupt, he is also from the family of Hrithik Ghatak, the famous filmmaker. So please bear this in mind. And Mahashweta Devi, the great literature.
I've only disappointed my family so by getting into the dismal science and having to comment on somewhat dismal state of affairs. But coming to, I think, Professor Ghosh gave a very broad and a big picture of the global economy as well as India, which I fundamentally agree with. So therefore, let me try to add some particular touches and nuances to that broad picture that we all kind of roughly agree with. I think the first point to note, and this is again not a new point, is the public health crisis is the primary one. So unless that is going to go away, the supply chain disruptions, the demand, side shock because of the falling incomes, all this will continue to happen. If you think of a medical analogy, I mean, the real problem is stemming from the public health side of things. And of course, the kind of policy responses that are being undertaken for that, which some, in the case of India, I would say I'm broadly supportive of, but most I am not. But coming to, therefore, I think unless that is happening, or what the prospect, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's a treatment, it's really hard to really project what's going to happen in the next 6 months, next year, etc. But I did an interesting calculation, which I think relates directly to Dr. Souza's question. So the IMF and several other international institutions give out their projected growth rates for 2020. We have the one for 2019, and then we have the estimated for 2021. So while thinking about this panel, I did a simple calculation as to suppose we start with the pre-pandemic levels of GDP, right? Then of course the world GDP has fallen about 5 to 6%, depending on how you do it. India's case, it's roughly 6%, okay? And then for developed countries, advanced economies, it's 8%, etc. But suppose we ask the question, what are they estimating what will happen in 2021, right? What kind of, after the projected recoveries that they're pointing out? Essentially, what is going to happen is that the world GDP is going to be roughly the same as it was in 2019, a little bit higher, but roughly the same. So therefore, that goes into the J or the L or whatever, any tumbling alphabet, that you can think of. But the point is that therefore recovery for the whole world GDP is in the ballpark of roughly where it was in 2019. Maybe depending on how you're estimating, it might be 1 to 1.5% higher. In the case of India, what is being estimated that it'll rise by 6%, and that is where I think we have to be a bit skeptical about these projections, because if you actually look at the 2018, 2017, 2019 numbers, there was a deceleration of the growth rate. And, a lot of people have commented on it. I have commented, Professor Ghosh has commented, many others have commented it. And we should be getting into the reasons for that. So therefore, if I want to sum up, I think that there is heterogeneity, and indeed the worst performers are some Latin American countries like Brazil, Mexico, and compared to that, India doesn't look so bad. But compared to East Asian economies, including China, India's overall picture doesn't look very positive. And whatever positive outlook that we can see seems to be based on assumptions that do not gel very well with the pre-existing trends before the crisis started.
It's really good to get a sense of what's going on globally, and I think you're right. Latin America is really suffering, and I don't know how they're going to come out of this. But coming to India, Professor Ghosh, now we've been in the middle of this pandemic for quite some time. You've seen the policies that the government here has initiated. Can you give us a sense of what has gone well and what has not gone well as far as the policy response is concerned?
I have to really sort of pinch myself to make myself sound balanced in this, because I find it so hard to think of the things that have been done right. When Moitish was saying that there are some things I agree with, I was racking my brain saying, okay, which one? But let me put it this way. I think the policy response has been badly timed, over-centralized without being properly coordinated, wrongly administered, cruelly, brutally administered, I would say, having no recognition of the fact that 95% of our workers are informal and have no legal and social protection, and therefore would basically be wiped out by such a complete lockdown. Locking down when you don't have too many incidents of the disease, and locking down all over the country with 4 hours notice, without any kind of preparation, has incredibly bad impacts, not just on economic activity, but as we know, on livelihood, on everything. What we have done is actually destroyed the economic prospects of a generation and of a very large number of informal workers in the foreseeable future. When we say that Latin America is in very bad shape, that's because about 85% of their economy is formal. So they recognize, they know when somebody's job goes. We have the other extreme. 85% or more of the workers are in informal enterprises, but about 95% are informal workers, which is to say they have no particular rights and certainly no social protection. Now here, when there's a collapse of economic activity, we're going to find out much, much later. In fact, given the current state of the data, we may never find out because they won't probably release another consumption survey in the near future and so on. People are forced to go out and work because they have no other means of livelihood, but they're earning half of the previous money wage at best for half of the days of employment. We're talking about a recovery, so-called recovery of employment, that is based on at least a halving of the already very, very low wages. And we're talking about a situation where many, many activities have simply not recovered, and we don't know whether they will ever come back. And I don't just mean things like, a lot of air travel or restaurants and hospitality, things which are very obviously affected by the pandemic per se, but just the sheer negative multiplier effects of this collapse are going to persist for a while, unless there is some very strong positive impulse coming in some direction. That impulse can only come from the state. It cannot come, obviously households don't have money, employers or private sector is not going to invest when there's no demand. It has to be the state. My concern is, and I'm sorry, I'm taking too long, but I just make this final point. My concern is that I fear that the government is so trapped in this notion of fiscal discipline, etc., that it's going to, over the course of this year, it's going to cut spending, not increase it. It has already front-loaded a lot of its spending, so-called. It's showing no signs of continuing that into the next few months in a very major way. State governments have spent practically their entire annual budget already in the first 3 months. They're going to have no money at all, and their borrowing limits have already been reached by August. So there seems to be no sign, and the government has announced that they can't even give them GST compensation, which is their due. So my fear is that just as they have done in the last 2 years, they have actually cut their spending as their revenues have collapsed. There is a very strong possibility that they will do this again. In which case, what are we getting? Household consumption collapsing, investment demand collapsing, government spending collapsing. So all these estimates, 5% decline, 6% decline, I think they're up the creek. Right now, we know GST has declined in the first 4 months of this year by 40%. Index of industrial production is down by 48% in the first 3 months of the year. We know that these are actual real numbers, okay? I do not see how GDP decline would have been anything less than 25%. But think of the negative multiplier effects of that over time, and think of what it means when even the government is spending less. So I would be very hesitant to say, oh, it's going to come down and then go up again like a V, because unfortunately, this is not a trampoline. It doesn't work that way.
Yes, it doesn't. In fact, I'm constantly amazed by the people who talk about a V-shaped recovery during this time, because it's a dual kind of shock, both demand and supply, and lots of businesses are going to go out of business. Professor Ghatak, now I'll be very careful. Professor Ghatak, from that external perspective, how do you see us in India and this response that you've seen? Now, of course, we're going to go to this generational impact point that Professor Ghosh made, but that comes a bit later. But how do you see it right now? What do you see the government, how do you see our policy response? And do you worry about anything? Are you happy about something?
No, I think that, again, going back to, I have written fairly extensively on this, and maybe if you look at some of our writings, that's one sector where the recession is not, so we have all been writing a fair bit on it. And I think that certainly my writing has been quite critical of the government policies, and I can go through the whole list of them. But I think since your question asked to figure out a few aspects of what went right, what went wrong. So I would say, okay, I mean, clearly the way the lockdown was implemented, how the migrant workers crisis unfolded, right? I think, again, I'm not a, there's of course data problems, but if we were to believe China's numbers, I don't think India's numbers are, in some ways data problems are everywhere. And I take no great faith in any of these developing or emerging country numbers, but certain relative movements are informative. So let me give you a few numbers that will give us some picture of this. First of all, if we just look at the health numbers, which again are noisy and likely to be not fully reliable. If you look at the India's daily new confirmed cases per million people or daily new confirmed deaths per million people, that's roughly now respectively higher than the world average and exactly equal to the world average.
Yeah.
If you look at the totals, not the daily, then India is less, but you can calculate the trends here, right? If the daily change is happening this way. But this is where Brazil, Mexico, South Africa have done far worse. And you can see a clear correlation between their public health numbers, which are relatively more reliable, and their economic statistics. So therefore, while the presence of the informal sector, again, forms a big part of my own research as well as writing, and Professor Ghosh is surely right in pointing out the core numbers, I still think that there is something about that's happening in Latin America that's clearly, it's not all due to greater formalization on these economies, unless the public health figures are all being equally kind of biased in the same direction. But that's a minor, it's not a serious disagreement. And in particular, the V, J, whatever, as I said, my summary of the IMF report is essentially they're using a projected growth rate, which is essentially ignoring the pre-existing trends. So how that is going to exactly lead to the V-shaped recovery is not clear at all. But coming now to very specifics, one of the things in which India really stands out is there's been a graph that has been circulating based on the actual number of cases, right? Confirmed cases at the lockdown point and at the partial lifting of the lockdown point. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting. There's no flattening. I think this is one of the really scary bit of that graph is it's actually sharply rising. So therefore, in terms of this Oxford study that gives various stringency scores to various countries in terms of various ways in which the lockdown was enforced, India's number is quite high. I mean, not the highest, but it's around 80 out of, about highest of 100. And if you actually, I did, I don't want to bore the audience with all the sort of specific numbers, but I did a quick calculation of these confirmed cases and then deaths with some proportion to the stringency measure. And that's where you can see that there is a gap there. That given how stringent the action was, the actual health outcomes have actually been quite disappointing, right? So if, for example, the health numbers showed up, I mean, clearly there's a trade-off. I mean, if you could curb the health numbers, then the economic shock or whatever economic cost would have been higher. We understand the trade-off. But coming now to the economic things, I'll just say a few things and let the discussion move on. So first of all, as I said, that I think that I and several others have pointed out that despite all the 10%, 20%, all these wonderful numbers, the actual incremental fiscal over the line expenditure is more to the tune of 1 to 2%. Okay, yeah. And I actually did a calculation compared to other developing countries. So therefore, it's one thing to say developed countries are doing 10%, 12%, but you could well argue that there is some kind of an underlying affordability factor as well as your credit rating in the international market, all these factors. But even compared to developing countries, in fact, let me quote out one piece of statistics, that India's essentially demand boosting spending, if you convert in current exchange rates, is about 14 pounds to Indonesia's 44, China's 240, and Brazil's 275. So these are economies, which of course, several of them are richer than India, but they're not like Germany or the UK, whatever, that we are not really compared like with like. So again, I'm completely with Professor Ghosh that it has been very inadequate. It's largely been supply side. When the real problem is the demand side, you can try to prop up a business, but unless you create income generating activity that will generate demand, the shops will stay open, but there will not be business. So that's the critique number two, that there is a lot of supply side thinking. And that's just, by the way, not just India. Across, you know, a range of policy responses, that's a real problem. I would say the only thing, if we were to really bend over backwards and try to be fair in terms of the whole portfolio of packages, the incremental allocation to Narega, again, quite falling short of what would have been, what the crisis would have demanded, as well as the boosted PTS entitlement, which has been extended. I would say these are the, two things one should point out in terms of, things that were in the right direction, even though, again, I'm not at all supportive of the scale at which it was done. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Yeah, that's very interesting and insightful. This idea that even if we don't compare India to the richer world, just to the developing economies, India's fiscal response has been extremely, extremely disappointing. In fact, this whole idea that ratings agencies are going to downgrade India, it's, to my mind, it's, sorry to say, it's stupid, because if you don't have a good fiscal policy response right now, you're going to be, stuck with a terrible situation in the future, and you'll probably get a governance downgrade later on. But anyway, Professor Ghosh, could we now look forward? Because I know we know what's going on right now, but this will have consequences for the future. I have my own views on how long-lasting this is going to be. When the Great Recession hit in 2008, the United States took about more than a decade to get back to pre-crisis trajectory. But remember, that was just a financial sector shock, which then obviously got transmitted to the real economy. This time, we're buffeted in all sides. Our banking sector is already weak. You talked about a generational impact. Could you elaborate a bit on that? And then also, maybe after that, we're going to get into what should India be doing. But what do you see as the long-term impact of this crisis?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot I was muted. Yes, thank you so much for that question. I think so much depends on what the government does. So it's very hard to predict until we know what the government will do. If we go with baseline, that is, they do nothing beyond what they have already done, then I foresee very, very dark days. I foresee, whatever shape you want, but it's closer to an L, if not just a downward trajectory. And that, of course, has generational impact. Why? Because this was supposed to be the time of our big demographic dividend. We have all these young people, more of whom are educated than ever before, many of whom have gone to privatized education. 70% of them have paid for their education. Some families have gone into debt. Some families have sold land. They are all out there looking for jobs. And now we know that instead of new jobs, everyone's losing jobs. And up the stream, pink slips at the upper levels and just complete job losses at the lower levels. So it's a very, very severe sort of generational impact. I can see this because I am a teacher and I see my students and their siblings and their friends. And it's a terrible betrayal of all of the future that they had been led to expect in some ways. But as I said, so much depends on what the government does. And of course, delay is a huge problem. The longer you take to make these decisive measures, the worse the problem will be and the more you will have to spend. It's not kicking a can down the road because the can grows in size as it rolls. And so I think the problem is really what the government will do and how quickly it will do it. So far, unfortunately, given the experience we've had with demonetization, with the way GST was implemented, and the lack of government response in terms of adjusting the imbalances that were created by their own policy mistakes, I don't think we can hope for more. I still nonetheless hope, because it's too important for all of us. It matters too much. And so I sincerely hope that they will realize what a tragedy this is and do something about it. I could quickly tell you what I think has to be done immediately right now anyway, but yeah, okay. So I noticed that some of these issues have already come up in your chat, so I'm very glad that this is already being raised with the AIPC. Immediately increase the number of days of employment to 200 under the Manrega, immediately, okay? Because many states have already reached 80, 90, 95 days. And so there will be no more employment for all of the people who have actually nothing else to do. This month is not a good indicator because it's the sowing month, but from August, we're going to once again see a major problem. Increase it to 100 days, I would argue, increase it to all adults, not just per household. That would require a change in the law. So you can simply double the number of days immediately without change in the law. I would also argue that in addition to public works, you should actually think of a way of subsidizing the MSMEs, the micro and small enterprises who have been completely devastated by this, by allowing some work in MSMEs up to the value of the wage, and the remainder sort of like a wage subsidy to the MSMEs, which it's a combination of a demand and a supply kind of move, if you like, and bring in an Employment Guarantee Act for the urban areas. I was actually delighted to hear from the minister that they are thinking of an Urban Employment Guarantee Act. I think that's, or at least an urban guarantee program, employment program, that's absolutely essential. There has to be some compensation for the livelihood lost. So while I'm not otherwise a big advocate of a UBI, I think at least a 3-month payment of 7,000 a month, 7,500 per month to 80% of the households is fitting and just, because these are people who were deprived of livelihood through your policies. They didn't choose to stop and go out to work, you stopped them. So you have to give them a compensation, 7,500 per month to 80% of households. Full universal PDS to anybody who wants it, 10 kilograms free for 6 months. Not 5 kilograms for only those who have ration cards, the central ration card, but to anybody who wants it. There are ways of doing this. We have specific detailed proposals, if necessary, about how you could do this without a ration card. But we calculated that all of this together would not cost you more than about 3.5% of GDP. Now that's a lot, it's additional spending, but you know, other countries are doing it. Borrow from the central bank. It will not be inflationary in the current scenario. We do not have, at the moment, we have a current account surplus. We don't even have a deficit because our demand has slumped so much. So we don't have an external constraint. Our external public debt is not high. This is the time when we can actually do this. This would enable an immediate revival of the economy. These are just the immediate measures. Of course, there are medium-term measures.
Yeah, these are good suggestions. I still don't understand why the government is sitting on some of these suggestions. Professor Ghatak, do you see? Well, obviously, we want to get to what the government should be doing immediately, but also how do you see this crisis playing out in the coming years? Just a few years back, I think 2017-18, we started seeing a reversal of the poverty reduction trends in India. That means poverty started going back up. We saw that in consumption data, and that was before this crisis struck.
Right.
What do you see happening going forward?
No, again, I think that we may debate the specifics, but I'm broadly in agreement with the picture that Professor Ghosh painted in terms of the set of policy options that we should be focusing on. So I don't have any fundamental disagreements on that. So once again, let me turn coming second into something advantageous by going on and a few different tangents. Okay, other than noting that universalization of PDS as well as an urban version of the employment guarantee, I'm always a bit skeptical about, wage subsidy type things, given, of even the credit guarantee stuff, the non-bank, the whole NPA stuff, if we were already sitting on a whole bomb there, given how our bureaucratic administrative system works, we could be really creating a real, stink bomb that could, really cause grief in the future. But once again, this is, debating engineering as to how to do it. Otherwise, if we could have a clear way of doing wage subsidies, that would be a combined supply come demand side measure. I have no direct disagreement on that. But now let me make a couple of sort of different points. First of all, it's interesting that one of the things that has not been being commented so much on again, starting with what many of us felt was a demand constraint, symptoms of a demand constrained economy, right? Created by forced GST, forced formalization, as well as demonetization, the income losses. And because of slack consumer demand, even corporate investment, that fell. So that was happening up to the point of, when this particular crisis hit. I think if you ask me, one of the most alarming, and again, this is adding to what has been said, so I'm not skipping them because I don't think they're important. One thing is inequality. If you think about, if you're already worried about inequality, now let's even think of within country. The one is the across country issue, but let's stick to, within country issue. One of the core things I was telling one of my students, that in macroeconomics, we teach the difference between stocks and flows. And normally we make a note of it. And only when somebody makes some silly comment about GDP being confused, it's a stock, we smugly point out, hey, you have to distinguish between stocks and flows. And that's where it is. But hey, this crisis showed that when flow stops, stock is what you got, whether it's the food supply, whether it's your grocery stocks, whether it's your wealth, whatever you have, that's what allows, say, the not so poor people to survive, and this also means guaranteed salary payments that our public sector, gives to a very small fraction, depriving the whole rest of the economy, of course, from having that kind of an income guarantee. But, that kind of a ready guaranteed flow can also be viewed as an implicit stock, that you have this guaranteed job, which effectively gives you that. Now, the middle and the upper middle classes, if anything, are saving because of the restrictions on consumption, whether because of the constraints on going out, constraints on various kinds of spending opportunities. Whereas the poor have to save. I mean, one of the things that, again, I'm surprised there isn't not that much commentary on the, is the indebtedness. If you think about the migrant workers and what happened to them, how when you get chucked out of your existing kind of, already insecure position and you have to trek back home, is basically you sell off your mobile. You have to, essentially raise some loan, right? And that indebtedness coupled with the higher saving or forced saving of the middle and the upper middle classes, that is going to play out in, and then of course this indebtedness would lead to interest payments, from the poor to the more affluent, whether it's directly to the moneylender or because of in the economy, the more the government has to borrow, right? Essentially, interest payments are going to be made to the richest sections, those who hold government bonds, etc. So I think that's going to be a huge problem. Okay, so that's kind of one of the issues that we have to think about, and therefore certain corrective measures need to be in place, and for that we have to utter the dreaded R word, which is redistribution. So some aspects of that. I've been a long champion of universal basic income, and not because I think it's a great policy, but we know that in a messed up world, what is not an ideal policy, if we could have perfect central planning, for example, we would create an alternative economy, which would be lovely, but that's not the world we live in. So based on all the problems of in-kind transfers, one of the arguments I have made is income transfers should be made complementary with them, because often some, I would say more in the statist left, immediately goes, hey, you're dismantling the welfare state, you're dismantling the public sector and all of that. And that's really like a red herring. I mean, I don't think any serious proposal of income transfer programs are saying that you should have serious cuts on this. But hey, during this period, as I'm glad that Professor Ghosh pointed out, a lot of people who are normally skeptical of this policy, you would kind of say, hey, when you're being chucked out of your job and you have to trek back your village, PDS is good, Narega is good, but how is the transition going to be funded, right? You need money, or you have to go to the moneylender. So I think therefore, and again, I could go on and on, but I want to have, time for the Q&A. And therefore I just want to make, other than this inequality and indebtedness point I made, I think whatever we do, some component of an income transfer, it doesn't have to be a huge amount. I mean, it can be adjusted given where the level of the GDP is, et cetera, but it will provide residual liquidity to people, especially to fund things that you cannot get out of PDS or until the economy is recovering. So that's point number one. Point number two, again, I'm a bit surprised that this didn't come up. hey, we got to go, full Keynesian here. We have to fund public health. It's a public health crisis. So we cannot just, not look at that particular elephant in the room, that whether it's hiring of healthcare workers, whether it's building up capacity, which, for example, in tests and other things, we are falling, quite a bit behind compared to, again, peer countries. So that's, again, something that going forward should be a big part of our recovery strategy.
Yes, it should be. But, I see that we don't have a lot of time left, and I do want to get to some of the questions that are posed in our chat box. And I see this kind of theme about, in some ways, some blue sky thinking. I mean, what, Professor Ghosh, can there be a new economic model that emerges from this? What do you think about Atmanirbhar Bharat that the Prime Minister has come up with, this self-reliance model? Or is there something else that India should be shooting for? How do you see our post-COVID kind of world? Is there a possibility that we come up with something dramatically different?
Well, ideally, I would say we have to come up with something dramatically different. And it has to be something that envisages a much greater role for public spending. Definitely in health, as Mojesh was saying, but in a whole range of others where we have been hugely remiss throughout our development experience. In education, we have increasingly allowed it to get more and more privatized and commercialized, therefore denying access of good quality education to a large number of people. Basic housing, I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One can go on and on. We all know about those various development failures. And I think we all know that these are not things that are going to happen through private spending alone, private investment alone. They will necessarily require much more state spending, which in turn will necessarily require more state resources, which means bringing back and thinking about seriously a wealth tax. There's a wonderful estimate by Srinivas Subramaniam which says if you just tax the top 965 richest individuals in the country, 4%, which they won't even notice. And most of their incomes, by the way, have gone up by 15% in the time of pandemic. Tax them at 4%, you get 1% of GDP. That can double your health spending. Okay, just as an example, bring back inheritance tax, tax multinationals. There is a proposal for unitary taxation of multinationals, which basically means that all the multinationals operating in your country, you tax them according to their global profits, based on a formula that relies on your share of their total sales, all your users or what have you, and employment together. And that will actually allow them to be taxed at a similar rate to domestic companies. At the moment, they get away with nothing, almost, including in India. So there are ways of raising the revenues. These are very, very different models. I think we have to also go for more sort of decentralized types of economies, particularly in the food economy. And I don't mean this necessarily in a completely sort of, reversal kind of thing. But let's face it, the global food supply chain sucked. It actually meant that you exported a lot of your raw primary products and got them back in frozen and processed forms. And this is across the world. It's bad for your health, it's bad for your local economy. It makes very little sense. So I think the pandemic has actually exposed some of those failures in global supply chains, which we can rectify if we can actively promote. Now, frankly, the Atmanirbhar Bharat that is being proposed today, there's a joke among all the working class people whom I meet is that, basically it's the government telling you to Atmanirbhar ban jao because no one else is going to help you. And certainly we aren't. So the government is not going to help you, so you're on your own. And I think put it this way, there are different ways of being so-called self-reliant. And you cannot go to a very autarkic or even very closed kind of scenario. That's pointless and it's also wrong. But there are ways in which to reduce strategic dependence. Some of us have been saying for at least 8 years that it's dangerous to be dependent on bulk drug import from one country. You have to wait till there's a border conflict to realize that that's a problem. Some of us have been saying that we should be generating much more of our software in the things that we use regularly, because we claim we're a software giant, but we are importing currently more software than we export, and so on and so forth. So these are things that we could do through industrial policy. I would say let's just think of a rational, sensible trade and industrial policy that doesn't mean closing off everything, and it isn't a sort of macho nationalism, but it's just based on a way of generating a possibility of growth that generates employment and is redistributive, as Madresh was saying.
Interesting, very interesting. Professor Khattak, same question to you. Is there a possibility of a radically different economic model emerging after COVID-19?
I think we have, it's our duty to hope so and have a dream that this can happen. But based on, the current scenario, whether it's likely or not, that's a, different discussion. So once again, I largely agree with the thrust of all the things that Professor Ghosh said. So let me kind of try to just, make a few broad points. I think one of the things that, again, maybe in this particular crowd, no one needs convincing, but, across the world, across India, this whole GDP focus and the GDP growth rate. And then, of course, once you start focusing on that, as we know from standard economics of incentives, you have every reason to, polish the data in a way, so that, the growth rates look, look good and all of that. I think that to make a very kind of somewhat philosophical point here, I think what this crisis showed all of us, whether directly in our personal lives, as well as all the, the crisis and the really tragedy that unfolded and unfolding in front of our eyes, is it is much more important to have some core economic security as the core foundation of an economy. I think, again, these are some of the points that Professor Ghosh said in terms of whether, we don't want to be inward looking. We want to look out in the world. We want to, use the best of technology, talent, resources. But on the other hand, resilience is something that I think what this crisis has showed all of us, right? Whatever your salary level, tomorrow you could be out of a job. Whatever, promotions or growth you were enjoying, tomorrow the whole engine could stop, right? So therefore, I think we need to think about, really come a bit away from sustained improvements in standard of living, the abject poverty problem, which as Salman, you pointed out, and the NSS numbers were released for a window of 2 weeks, then withdrawn and all of that. And Jayati's colleague Himanshu wrote one of the early essays on this, and including S. Subramaniam has written extensively on this, that whatever picture that comes out of it, whatever the statistical issues with them, is actually there has been marginal increase in poverty, over the very latest estimates, and some of this crisis wouldn't have helped there. So I think we should really, at some level, take stock and say what's really important in our economic lives. And that's really, in the end, I think, for the kind of crisis that unfolded with the migrant workers, I would like to believe, and again, I'm naive, that whatever your political ideology, you don't want to see that happen in a decent society where really people are kind of, they have to sleep on the railway tracks, they're getting run over by the train, there are child kind of crying on the railway platform with a parent, having died from the journey. I really feel that we can set aside our ideology, we can set aside our also engineering differences, that, okay, we have the same objective, but, you may think this would be a better way of doing it. I may think this is another way of doing it. We will have all those disagreements, and that's healthy. But I really feel that we should, honestly, we should think about having an economy that's more resilient and protecting the most vulnerable, as well as, this public health crisis, which everybody is exposed to. Of course, the poorer you are, the more your threats, the more vulnerable you are. I would say, therefore, we need to have some kind of a welfare state with strong public health investment, the kind of economies have done relatively well, like Germany, right? And that's where I think the vision should be, as opposed to showing off growth rates and, we are 1% more than China or 2% less. That game has to really go.
Thank you so much. This is such an important point, this point about resilience. I worked on natural disaster management. We're always talking about what is going to be the worst case scenario. Are you prepared for it? Are you resilient? And even now, I would pose this question to policymakers. Are you ready for the worst case scenario? What if there is no vaccine for months? And what happens if it is to be manufactured and distributed over years? What happens then? Because right now, everybody thinks that there's going to be the Oxford vaccine coming up in October. Then, by the end of the year, there'll be 100 million doses or 500 million doses or 1 billion doses. The whole infrastructure for distributing those vaccines and administering them We have no idea how it's going to play out. It has been a bit of a somewhat of a difficult session in the sense that things are a bit bleak because the government, I think, in India has not, in my view, and I think you guys both agree, that has not risen to the challenge as well as it could have. At the same time, there is hope there, because ultimately, if we can push the government to do more at the stage, maybe we can reduce or mitigate the worst impacts of this crisis. Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh. Thank you so much, Professor Ghatak, for being with us. I couldn't really go to individual questions in our chat box, but I think by asking these broad questions, I could see that we were addressing many of these questions. I think we've reached the end of the time. Shashi, any parting thoughts from your side? Thank you very much, AIPC.
Thank you, first of all, to Salman for having ably moderated the stimulating discussion. Jayati and Maitreesh for having taken a subject which frankly could have been very depressing, and without pulling your punches, showing us all that is wrong, inadequate, and frankly wanting in the government's response, coming up with constructive approaches to dealing with them. We will obviously take your ideas very much on board. Some of the thoughts that have come up in this conversation will undoubtedly be fed by us into the policy-making process of the All India Professionals Congress and the AICC. I certainly hope that the country can continue thinking about the very important issues that you have actually managed to put with such admirable lucidity before all those listening. Thank you once again, Salman Soz, Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor Maitreesh Ghatak, and all who joined. We'll be taking a short break. Alim will give us the details, and we'll be back at 5 o'clock to discuss politics with Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Yamini Iyer. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
And do stay on if you can.
Thank you very much, Professor Ghosh, Professor Ghatak. Please do stay on with us. We have a lovely session coming up next with Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Yamini Iyer, moderated by our very own chairman, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
I think he meant 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock.
Yes, he meant 4 o'clock. It'll begin in a little over 10 minutes. It'll be on the same Zoom chat, so you can stay on. We look forward to having you there. Thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, as our moderator Salmanji said, we were unable to take some of the questions. What we will be doing is we will be uploading some of the key points that were mentioned by our wonderful moderator, by our wonderful panelists on social media. So we look forward to any comments and inputs over there. Thank you once again. And if I could please request our team, Mr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Yamini Iyer, I hope if they're there, if they can please be made co-hosts so we can test the sound. And Alok, if I could request you to stop the recording. Thanks, Alok.
Welcome, Yaminiji. You should be able to unmute yourself at will.
Yes, it's working.
Okay. Mr. Mehta.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi. We'll be starting in 10 minutes. So at this moment, the recording is stopped. Just waiting for the session to be refreshed.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Are we still live on YouTube? Or
yes, YouTube is streaming. If we stop that, then we'll have to republish the link for the next session all over social media.
Okay, so
we're just going to be playing some of our promotional videos. If you're not a fellow yet of the All India Professionals Congress, we've just launched our brand new 4.0 version of our website. So www.profcongress.com. You can join us and be a partner for progress. We'll be beginning in about 10 minutes time with the chairman. Thank you.
Okay. Good to see you, Pratap and Yamini. Welcome.
Good to see you, Salman, really.
The idea is to bring in young professionals into politics, to give them space, to allow them to give us their ideas so we can place them in the policy making. And the idea is to bring in young professionals into politics, to give them space to...
My apologies, there was a slight technical issue. We'll be playing it once again. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries.
Pratap, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Nice of you to make the time for us. Thank you. The first two seminars went very well. We had two excellent discussions.
Absolutely. I caught a glimpse of the last one, and it's really seemed to be in a roll. Pity we didn't have more time.
Right, we have the same problem. Hello, Yamini. Glad you could join us. We'll have the same problem, Pratap, because there's so much ground to cover. But we also were attentive to the attention spans of people who, especially these days of COVID, are probably over webinared out. But we had no other way of getting some of these ideas out to the public. So we've gone ahead and done everything within 45 minutes. I'll try and keep it crisp, and I would urge you both to not let any of your answers be longer than a couple of minutes. Try and get the topics in, and if something seems a bit elliptical, I may ask you to elaborate. But we should just try and keep the flow going so we can use the time well.
And all we need to say is that, Mr. Tharoor and Mr. Soos have the answers anyway. So that's stipulate.
You're not going to get so easily off the hook, because today our job is to ask the questions. And we're getting the experts to give us the answers. And I must say that Harsh Mandar and Vandana Shiva on society, and thereafter Professor Ghosh and Professor Khatak on economy, both gave us some very, very solid insights. And I have to say that I think we got off onto a high standard discussion. With politics, of course, we're dealing with slightly less tangible, measurable things. and therefore lucidity and brevity will be all the more important. But you got my email, Yamini. Pratap responded. I don't know if you had a chance to.
I did. Sorry, I just saw it, but yes, I got it. So
it's kind of a broad and fairly general conversation, which I think neither of you will have any difficulty whatsoever in sharing your thoughts about all of this. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And Alim will now tell us in a couple of minutes how the mechanics of this will work. Alim, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We have about 4 minutes. I thought we could start a minute or two early. Thank you so much, Mr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Yamini IRG for joining us today. Your conversation is with our chairman, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Our conversation is scheduled for 45 minutes. So it's a 35 minute interaction between the three of you, and then perhaps 10 minutes for questions from our audience. The chairman will receive the questions from the audience via the Zoom chat that's there. To our audience members, please do share your questions and a little bit about yourself, your name, your chapter, and your profession if you can, and we will escalate that to the chairman. Because there's a shortage of time, we will try and do our best to accommodate as many questions as we can. But if we can't, we apologize. We will try and organize another session soon. I just wanted to let you know that as soon as we begin, this will be recorded and this will be edited by our team later on so that our fellows can enjoy it as well. Our colleague Amitabh Dubey, who is the policy coordinator of AIPC, will be live tweeting some of the memorable quotes from this conversation. They will be attributed, of course, to the person who said it. All of this will be available on our social media. Chairman, we are 2 minutes away, but Alok, if you can begin recording, we can start. Perfect. We're now recording, Chairman. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this 3rd anniversary celebration of the All India Professionals Congress, a platform for India's working professionals to relate to the politics of our country, to offer their ideas and thoughts, and to interact with experts from around this nation and those working on India elsewhere. Today, we have had our celebration in the form of a nationwide webinar trying to cover some of the key issues facing the nation. At 2 o'clock, we kicked off the National Conclave by discussing Indian society, particularly in the aftermath of COVID and the lockdowns and everything else related to the coronavirus. That discussion, moderated by Sushmita Dev, the chairman of the All India Mahila Congress, featured the civil society activist and former IAS officer Harsh Mandar, and Vandana Shiva, a writer, activist, and indeed environmentalist. And the three of them discussed social trends in a most engaging way, followed by a slightly more difficult discussion in terms of the bad news all around on the economy, moderated by Salman Soz, the deputy chairman of the All India Professionals Congress, and featuring two eminent economists, Professor Jayati Ghosh and Professor Maitreesh Kotak. We now turn to the other aspect of the challenges facing India these days, and that is politics, the world of politics, the ideas and issues dominating politics, and the prospects as we go through this extraordinary period of the coronavirus and its related afflictions. To join me in this discussion, and I'll be asking the questions rather than providing the answers, we have two very, very distinguished people who have worked at the intersection of scholarship and public policy as public intellectuals. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is a former president of the Center for Policy Research. In this capacity, he was well known for many, many things that he said and did and wrote. He maintained a distinguished column as a contributing editor at the Indian Express, then went on to become Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University, a position which he has relinquished while continuing as Professor of Political Science at Ashoka. He's a noted scholar of political science and constitutional law, but he brings the issues that he deals with professionally down to the thinking reader of the Indian Express and of other journals and publications. Yamini Iyer is the present President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research. But even before she rose to that leadership position, she was already leading the flourishing Accountability Initiative, promoting transparent governance through a variety of discussions and research and efforts in formulating policies on transparency and accountability. A prominent expert on governance and social development, she has also worked extensively in local government at the World Bank. So thank you, Pratap and Yamini, for making the time to join All India Professionals Congress in discussing the very, very interesting issues facing the nation. And I think the first question that I will turn to both of you on, and perhaps Yamini, I could ask you first. How do you see the current political situation in India? Professor Suhas Palshikar, writing in the Indian Express, wrote that essentially on the 24th of March, all Indian democratic politics was suspended. Is that the way you see it? Has there been a diminution of the processes of democracy and of political give and take that should normally characterize a country like India? How do you see it? If so, what are the elements? And if you disagree, what are the areas in which you feel that politics is still thriving? Yamini Iyer. Yamini, you're muted. You'll have to, yes.
The challenge of Zoom is that it mutes you just when you're ready to start speaking. There might be something in there. But first of all, thank you very much for having me, and a very, very warm congratulations to the All India Professionals Congress on your 3rd anniversary. Pleasure to be here and find the tables a little turned the other way. Usually we'd ask you about politics, but let me give it a try as an observer and a student of politics. I think you're right that on the 24th of March, politics came to a standstill in the sense of the institutional forms of the practice of politics that we are somewhat used to. Parliament was suspended, continues to be. Usual forms of street protests suddenly found themselves impossible to do. And I think a lot of our politicians, and particularly our opposition, all of you included, found yourselves somewhat stymied as in that, how do you support an effort to address a pandemic whilst at the same time play your critical role as the opposition asking questions of government. We'll come to that in a minute, because I think even as institutional forms of politics as we understand them may have found themselves stymied consequent to the lockdown, we actually have seen some very important new trends in our politics and some old fault lines that have grown sharper that I feel we must pay attention to. And I want to point out just 3. First, let's start where it all began, the lockdown and that mass movement of our workers trying to leave our cities, desperate to go home. A lot has been written and said about the impact of the lockdown on incomes, on the absence of a robust social protection system that left people absolutely desperate, the role of fear in moving people home. But I think there's something else here that we haven't spoken about, which is an explicit articulation of a lack of trust in the Indian state, its political system and its institutional architecture in being able to protect us, especially at a time when we are at our most vulnerable. Think back to demonetization. Our politicians asked most of India to do something that was very hard. People followed, and it has always been a puzzle to many social scientists trying to understand this. In this particular instance, we were told very clearly that we mustn't cross the Lakshman Rekha of our home. Many attempts were made to mobilize us collective action-wise and, banging your thalis, lighting your mombatis, coming out into to support this exercise. And yet a vast majority of India said, I don't trust my state, I'm going home. I see implicit in there an important important form of silent protest, new kind of popular mobilization waiting for competitive party politics to actually work with. And I think what has been particularly disappointing to me in the course of these last 4 or 5 months that have been very difficult for India, that in fact, the competitive political party landscape has not been able to respond to, I think, a very clear cry from citizens, which came in the form of the willingness to walk home, even if it meant you had to take on a very arduous and difficult journey. So that's the first point. Second, I think we are seeing a very important fault line in our federal politics. This is not new. It's been emerging over the last many years now, but getting much sharper in that public health is essentially a state subject. We saw from March 24th a deep form of centralization, leaving states with very little except to come back repeatedly to the center with a begging bowl, asking for the center for money to be able to address the challenges they confront. But at the same time, an interesting oscillating yo-yo between centralization and handing powers back to the state, which is now currently the case. So, and I think the politics of that, the absence of institutional fora for deliberation, of negotiating center-state dynamics, and the absence of a robust space for this politics to articulate itself has become extremely sharp. And I think one of the most critical fault lines of party competition going forward also are going to rest in how this federal story plays out. And last but not the least, even as a lot of everyday politics found itself in a stuck, there was a lot of business as usual politics that has continued through the pandemic, which we need to interrogate a little bit further. A lot of the pre-pandemic shift in our politics towards deeper authoritarianism, communalism, majoritarianism found its expression under the guise of the pandemic over the last 3 or 4 months. In particular, the handling of the Delhi riots being an important case, the role of our core institutions, the Supreme Court being critical, and the undermining of due process and the rule of law that has continued, all of which seems to suggest to me there are forms of new politics that are opportunities and the old fault lines getting sharper and deeper in the absence of the ability of the mainstream competitive party political landscape to revive itself and be responsive.
Thanks, Yamini. Pratap, Yamini's covered an awful lot of ground in her answer. Do you broadly agree with the thrust of these? Are there additional points you might wish to add, or would you have a different perspective altogether on this issue?
No, it's, I mean, she's put them very eloquently. I'll just add a couple of things. I mean, I think we need to step back and look at the big picture. And since this is the All India Professionals Congress, I have to say this. There is only one big political question in India. And if that political question is not answered, there is not going to be any politics. And that question is there a future for the Congress party or an opposition party to actually challenge the BJP, right? I mean, that's the core of it. The long-term tendencies is the fact of the matter is we are in a single party dominant system now. And it looks like the BJP is going to be very, very difficult to dislodge. Last election, congressmen used to joke that we are going to fight in 2024, not 2019. It certainly looks like 2029 now at the very least. So how can you have, in a sense, politics when party politics is, literally in decline? Second, we have to understand that India now is in a position where all the basic structures of political life that we took for granted no longer exist. I teach constitutional law. I cannot walk into a constitutional law class and tell my students what the Indian Constitution is. If there is no habeas corpus, if federalism is up for grabs, or literally if parliament doesn't function, I just don't know what the Indian Constitution is, right? So that basic structure that we always used to tout, right, simply does not exist. The country is in a sense being held together, as I said, by that dominant party authoritarian structure. The second sense in which I think, and I think this is important to think when you think about politics, that, when we think of politics in India traditionally, we have often taken certain fault lines for granted. And Congress Party's great success in the 50s and 60s in building the nationalist movement was mobilizing those pre-existing fault lines in particular kinds of coalitions, right? So whether it's caste coalitions, we often relied on regional parties to act as a natural break on the centralization of power in case centralization got excessive. One of the profoundest shifts in politics in India, and I think the Congress party has not grasped it, or rather only the BJP has grasped it, no other political party has grasped it, which is that politics, in a sense, now has to be much more generative in terms of generating new coalitions and new identities. It cannot be based on a kind of sociological determinism that we will sit back and somehow the natural fragmentation of power in Indian society, caste, class, region, will somehow check as a brake on authoritarianism and give us the space to do different kinds of things. The BJP's great success, and in that sense, it's the only party that is actually doing politics. It understands identities need to be created. It understands, right, that in some senses, there are no natural coalitions and fault lines. Those have to be generated through the work of mobilization, through the work of symbolic articulation, through the work of propaganda, through the work of organizational acumen. And in that sense, the BJP is the only party that is playing quintessentially politics. Where is Congress? How can you have politics in the Congress? I mean, I hate to be graceless, but Rajasthan is a disgrace for the Congress party. And what is disgraceful about it is that you can't even call it politics as usual. Which chief minister unleashes the power of the state on his own party, right? So what you are getting is one political party that is consolidating authoritarian communal hold on every institution in India, but very intelligently, very powerfully in terms of commitment to organization. And the rest of the opposition either caught in a fatalist trap or frankly, just one litany of monumental pettiness after other. What is at stake in Rajasthan? Is this politics, right? I mean, this is like, you know, this is like a sort of semi-mafia enterprise run amok. So those are the bigger, deeper senses in which we need to think about politics, and that's the challenge staring us.
Thank you, Pratap. And obviously, I'm here to ask questions and not to debate you. But I will say that there is obviously a responsibility as well for the party ruling at the center in triggering off some of the events that you are rightly critical of in Rajasthan. But this is not the main thing. I think you've raised some important issues. Obviously, if you feel that India is now headed to a one dominant party structure, and Yamini feels, I believe rightly also, that the federal system is under enormous strain. We've already seen at the beginning of the lockdown the invocation of a rather obscure provision of the National Disaster Management Act to ride roughshod over everything, the law and order prerogatives of the states, the fiscal prerogatives of the states, and essentially to tell the states what the center was going to disallow and allow, including, of course, interstate and intrastate highway traffic, buses, trains, and so on. So you've really seen a fairly fundamental, if perhaps arguably temporary, transformation of Indian politics. But if I can come back to Yamini, I think a point that both of you were hinting at, but which is important to grasp, is that even if COVID has brought out some of these events and developments in sharp relief, a lot of them reflect trends that had been clearly evolving in the preceding 6 years. Certainly the gradual erosion of federal autonomy had been becoming more and more apparent, and COVID simply clinched it. The lockdown permitted the shutting down of the anti-CAA protests. But before that, the government's rather heavy-handed approach to protest and dissent had been manifest on a number of occasions, number of campuses, and so on and so forth. What would you see as the big trends preceding the COVID crisis that one could expect to see persisting or possibly accentuated in the post-COVID world? I'll ask you both the same questions, with starting with Yamini.
Sure, thanks, Shashi. I think in a way, from my perspective, you've sort of answered your own question in a sense. To me, the two, we have over the last 6 years and more, but more sharply in the last year, been seeing a fundamental effort to really re-articulate what certain elements of India or the idea of India that were taken for granted. And of course, many of these have been up for debate and for contestation for quite some time now. But the certainty in the direction that we were going, and interestingly, in the sort of aftermath of the CAA, the nature of the protestation that was beginning to emerge, which I think at least reopened some space for debate and re-engagement in the public sphere with some of the fundamental principles of what made India, the fundamental principles of our constitution, back into the public debate, have all now been shut down. And I think this is not something that is going to close off anytime soon, pandemic or no pandemic. It will find ways to reemerge. The challenge for us is how much of our politics is actually willing to take these discussions, how much of our mainstream politics is willing to take these issues up and actively engage with them from the bottom up. We aren't seeing that. And that to me is the biggest challenge. We celebrated during the CAA protests this sort of leaderless, apolitical nature of it in some senses, although it was deeply political. And I think that was actually wrong until this doesn't become part and parcel of competitive party politics. As long as competitive party politics says, I'm not going to touch these issues because it's strategically unwise for me to win an election with it, we will never actually get the kind of contestation we need to effectively preserve our constitution, preserve the institutions that we cherish, and ensure that we see some sensible settlement to some of these issues, which is not to say that where we were before 2014 or before, over these last 3 decades, these have been critical issues that have repeatedly found their way into contestation. It is actually telling of the nature of our politics that we haven't been able to have effective resolutions or effective debates around this. The federal question too has, I think, become increasingly sharper. And again, this predates COVID, although COVID, of course, brings it out in sharper relief at a time when, states should be given the powers to do what they need to do. I think we slowly might be getting there. But I think the important thing to remember is that what we saw in the 90s and the 2000s, the much celebrated deepening of federalism, towards the early part of 2010 onwards, the consequences of, or the imagined consequences of coalition governments sort of gave way to the idea that maybe too much federalism of a certain kind leads to a kind of politics of blaming that doesn't actually enable effective decision making. And there seemed to be a growing elite consensus in the direction of a little more centralization on some things. I think what we see today should be a real reminder that federalism is one of the most critical elements that have held this country together. They need to be preserved, but that also means that the nature of our politics needs to re-evolve. We mustn't forget that even as states were beginning to play a more central role in our party politics and in shaping policy, states were also very clear about how centralized they would be. The Chief Minister's office across this country, across all states, is perhaps the most powerful, leaving very little space for either sort of horizontal federalism within the state decision-making architecture and lower down to local governments. And in all of this, I think one thing, just a last point, we mustn't forget that our party politics has become far more centralized, even as we talk about decentralization, which is another important fault line in this debate.
That's an interesting thought, because in fact, there's some who say that the Congress party is an example of a more decentralized politics now, as our state leaders are acquiring more authority and more visibility in the process. But that's something we can explore further, I'm sure. Thank you, Yamini. Pratap, The same question, I won't repeat it in the interest of time. Pratap?
Yes, I won't repeat the points Yamini made about federalism. I think a couple of other things to think about. One, state-capital relations matter a lot more to Indian politics than we publicly acknowledge, or any politician will be publicly caught acknowledging. In the 50s and 60s, the Congress party had a certain accommodation with Indian capital. It changed the nature and character of that in the 70s and 80s. And I think one of the interesting trends now is, and it is a challenge, I think, going, in terms of challenging BJP, is that you are going to get a new state capital accommodation. And the new state capital accommodation has two features. One, most of capital is, BJP has managed to use state power or sometimes willingly align it with its purposes. It has created the instruments that it can mobilize the allocation of capital largely on its side. And the second feature of state capital is going to be that there is going to be, in a sense, greater concentration of capital. There's already powerful evidence on this. We will present this greater concentration of capital in India in terms of building national champions. Frankly, I think Atmanirbhar Bharat is largely an ideological cloak for creating some national champions, even at the risk of monopoly power and cross-sectoral dominance in the economy. Right? And that is to a very significant degree going to affect the kind of space opposition parties have. When Rahul Gandhi rightly complained that the media doesn't give him space or doesn't give opposition parties space, what do you think that's a function of? That's not a function of TRP ratings. I wish television channels were actually competing for popularity, because most television in India, most media in India is supply-side media, right? Okay. Can you think of any other economy in the world, any other economy where 2 or 3 companies between them will practically control 10 to 15 of the strategic sectors of the economy with this concentration of capital? But here's the good news. No political party is going to object to that, neither in government nor in opposition. Right? The second thing, I think, to build on one thing Yamini said, the federal story, I think there is a distinction to be made between administrative centralization and what I call political centralization. And the bad news is that even as the BJP is administratively centralizing, and frankly, this was a national compact, GST was going to have a centralizing impact, at least in terms of the powers to mobilize revenue. The fact of the matter is that many significant regional parties are either going to implode, or all the incentives are aligned that they will in fact align with the BJP or make their peace with the BJP, because the cultural issues, fault lines that define federalism have in a sense been taken off the agenda. So any Tamil party that governs in Tamil Nadu says, look, we can do business with whoever is in the center. I think Bengal is the next frontier waiting to fall. Frankly, I think we are underestimating the degree to which I think the TMC is likely to implode soon. So you will have this paradox that you will have administrative centralization, but that fatalism that we used to have 15 years ago, Bengal will provide some bulwark, Rajasthan will provide, that simply no longer exists. The one thing Mr. Tharoor is right about, I'm agnostic on this question about presidential form of government or not. I think any constitutional system, you have to make it work. There is no, as it were, pure design solution. But the one thing I think he is right about, which is that elections have now become genuinely national in a very different way from 15, 20 years ago. And what that means is that if you're a struggling smaller party or a newer party, the collective action that you have to mobilize to gain a foothold in the system is actually much higher rather than what you could do 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you, Pratap and Yamini. I mean, I think one of the issues that we do need to confront head on, of course, is the ongoing process, which clearly began in 2014, to change, Yamini's already used the phrase, so I can use it, the idea of India, into something else. And I think there seems to be this rather fundamental fault line, at least I see it, between a vision of India anchored in the liberal constitutionalism of the Constitution of 1950, that essentially promotes a civic idea of nationalism. That is, that we have institutions that we run that are relatively autonomous. We have free systems, elections, which preserve and enshrine our diversity and pluralism. We guarantee equality of treatment. No one is, at least essentially, no one is handicapped by the virtue of his or her birth into a particular religion, caste, location, mother tongue, or gender. Now, in practice, that was often more aspirational and fully realized, but everyone was working towards it and all the institutions collectively upheld that ideal. What we've been seeing in the last 6 years is the advocacy of a diametrically opposed ideal, the ideal of a Hindu Rashtra, the ideal of a nation that would really be much more monocultural in the sense of worshipping within one faith, much more monolingual in the sense of exalting Hindi, with BJP MPs in the Lok Sabha calling for Hindi to become the Rashtra Bhasha, and at the same time, much more centered on the values and concerns of the northern Indo-Gangetic plain, Hindustan, Aryavrat, use whatever term you want, and particularly issues like cow protection have come to the forefront, where the sort of vigilantism you've seen across North India in a multiple number of states against people either suspected or accused of transporting or holding or consuming beef would have been astonishing to imagine in any of the states of the South. So while Pratap may be right in suggesting a greater unitary trend in our politics, surely this evolution of our politics is likely to cause not only more alienation in other parts of the country, including the state you mentioned, Tamil Nadu, where people are going to mutter whether they want to be subsumed under this version of India, or whether indeed there is fertile opportunity for the rest of us who insist that the original conception of Indianness is worth fighting for to lead a good fight on this issue itself? Or is it that this issue is already settled, the vast majority of India is Hindu, the vast majority of Hindus want to go in that way, and therefore the rest of us will simply have to lump it? I mean, I'm curious as to your perception as outsiders and not caught up perhaps in the daily political contention that I am, how you see this evolving. Yamini, we'll have to ask you for brief answers, both of you, so we can take in some questions from the audience. Yamini.
So, Shashi, I believe that there is huge opportunity and space for India to have this conversation with itself, and and I think the core instinct, what keeps us together in our diversity, which requires a deeper federalism, is very much there. I am extremely skeptical of our current political system as it exists today to be able to do what is needed to be done. I think we always mistake where the BJP's conversation with India now in terms of the big money, the big propaganda. It started at the grassroots, it stays at the grassroots. And I think that the ability to go back and creatively restart mobilization, that is, I feel, missing right now in the current landscape of politics that we have. And I feel very skeptical and quite saddened because I don't see sparks of this emerging currently.
Pratap?
So 3 things very quickly. One, I do think we need a very different language than the one you just used, which is there is an old idea of India and there's a new idea of India. I think anything that smacks in a sense of kind of status quo ante, I think reminds people more of the deficiencies of the old idea of India. I mean, let's not forget Rajiv Gandhi did open the gates to Ayodhya. And Congress, for the longest time, thought that it could run a coalition of Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism within the party. And the BJP simply came along and said, well, we can just drop off the minorities. What we need is a new principled imagination centered on individual dignity and individual freedom that cuts across, whose core is no one shall be targeted and discriminated for who they are. That's in a sense the core constitutional principle. The second is an imagination centered around Articles 14, 19, and 21 of the Indian Constitution. Diversity is a trap because a lot of the conflicts that you feel in the modern world are actually conflicts within communities. I think gender is an extraordinary fault line. And it's amazing that it's the BJP that has walked away, right, with this fault line. Number three, I would not overestimate this North-South conflict. I think that Mr. Tharoor is pining his hopes on.
Not hopes, concerns.
I concerned, but you know that might give a wedge. Obviously, there are significant regional differences, but I think you would be underestimating the strength of BJP's cultural and grassroots transformation beyond the calculus of electoral politics. You know, in states like Karnataka, and including in some senses like Tamil Nadu. And let me be blunt about it. We can talk to the BJP and say, look, they want to, you know, use Hindi belt idioms, although they're politically astute, they have scaled back on it. But here's the bigger crisis. Congress party does not have 4 mesmerizing speakers who can hold more than 500 people in an audience if you ran an election in UP. Right? That's also another cultural fault line and another cultural reality that the BJP has tapped into in a state like UP. Right? In fact, I actually think North India politics is, in a sense, which is where the kind of anti-elite populism of Mr. Modi has its most powerful resonance, actually in part has to do with the sense that the Congress party cultural idiom became elitist and therefore unbelievable and unreliable in a very significant way. So that's actually, I think, a bigger challenge than, in a sense, North-South, in a sense, the North-South divide, because the BJP has tapped into that resentment of a vernacular marginalization in North India. That's actually far more significant. Hindutva is just sort of one aspect of it. And I think that's the thing we need to, in a sense, think about. What's the cultural idiom that can, in some senses, address that? And last word, which is, politics is about credibility. It's, frankly, ideas do matter, visions do matter, but you can come up with the most, incredible vision document that you want. And it's about hard work. I think this Mr. Modi is right about it. If in politics it's the contest between Harvard and hard work, in politics, hard work will win. And there, frankly, there is no match. So the issue is not so much what the idea of India is versus idea of, it is who are going to be the credible carriers of whatever idea that you want. Even now, on basic things like UAPA, civil liberties, sedition law, all the things that are coming to haunt us, right? We cannot look the Congress party in the eye and say, yes, we trust the party with, in a sense, these measures. That's the new institutional language you have to fight on, not on this diversity mantra. If there is freedom, diversity will happen anyway, and new forms of diversities will be created. But the diversity Congress had, which was pigeonholing everybody into a particular group, that's a much, much more deeper, I think, reason why it's not being able to defend that older idea of India.
Okay, well, you've said a lot of things that I'm tempted to react to, Pratap, but in all fairness, this is your and Yamini's forum, and we do have a number of questions that have come in from participants, and on which your views would be very welcome. I will say, by the way, on this question of Rajiv Gandhi opening the locks of Ayodhya, whether it's Rajiv Gandhi opened it or whether it's Arun Nehru opened it, and Rajiv Gandhi perhaps at best allowed him to get away with it, that's a different quarrel we can have. One of our participants, Saif Habibullah, has raised that point. I have Pushpa Ragya asking, how can the Congress party in a constructive manner combat the infiltration of BJP RSS propaganda into almost each and every institution of the country, especially the manipulation of media, institutions from CBI, NIA, IT, ED to even the SC. That's a tough one to answer. You've written about it a bit. Yamini, I don't know if you heard the question. I think you had to briefly leave your chair. Shall I ask Pratap then to respond? Did you hear it?
Yes, I heard it. A device went off.
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Yamini, then.
No, Pratap, just will you start? Sorry, I'll just gather my thoughts together. Sorry.
So it's a big question, but I think three quick things. One, and this is 101, you have to get the party organization and leadership story right. Because there are lots of people willing to work for you. But how do you work for an organization whose leader does not know what they want? You don't know what the norms and procedures of that party are, and you don't know what the party stands for, and you don't know whether the party even has a collective voice at all. Okay, so that it's just 101. Frankly, you know, if you fix that, you at least begin to have some sort of prospect. I think the second thing, and in that context, the AIPC is, I think, a wonderful organization. See, one of the advantages BJP has is it has created a social movement that is, in a sense, independent of electoral fortunes. The RSS was not playing for 5 years, for 10 years, it was playing for 50 years. In fact, a lot of the people who work and join the BJP have to say, they have a far greater proportion who actually think beyond an electoral life cycle. That insurgent grassroots fight is simply absent in the center or in the left or in the liberals at all. I mean, frankly, we can't do much beyond webinars and Zoom calls and, you know, another vision document. I mean, just do the math on it. How many times does an average BJP worker visit a constituent, right? And it's literally at that level. I mean, they, you know, we see it all around us, the way in which RWAs, for example, are mobilized. Not because there's a kind of single central direction, but you need a structure that gets familiar with the people again. And the third thing, which I will repeat, is you need a Hindi heart belt strategy. Because if the Hindi heart belt remains secure with the BJP, it's going to be almost impossible to dislodge it. And last and finally, just as even at the risk of being a little graceless, the Anshan regime in Congress cannot now carry even the best of ideas with any kind of public conviction. And Congress still has not grasped the fact that in election time, that's such wonderful fodder for Mr. Modi's central trope, which is the Anshan regime was a culture of elitism, a culture of entitlement, and frankly, a culture of... And even 6 years down the line, you have not done much to reclaim credibility on that score. So it's not that difficult. I just don't see the will in the party to want to do it.
Okay, tough comments, Pratap. Yamini, anything to add or disagree?
Just to add, actually, I really do think that the challenge for the Congress right now is, honestly, you all think that the way to deal with the propaganda machine of the BJP is through Twitter, and I do think that it's really important to remember that these reviving a party or building the credibility, because I think Pratap is absolutely right on the issue of credibility, will only come when you do the hard work of going back to the grassroots. And that's where a new vocabulary will emerge in a manner that will effectively be able to counter the vocabulary of the BJP that constantly sits in tension. And I think the real challenge that actually the entire political opposition as it exists today confronts is it constantly assumes that strategy will help me win the election, rather than remember that ultimately strategy is only the icing on the cake. You first have to have the basic ingredients of the cake. So that's not going to come without going back to the grassroots and without playing the long, hard game.
Okay, fair enough. We have over 29 questions from the audience. We don't have enough time. We'll extend by about 5 minutes for 10 minutes more if Pratap and Yamini are willing. Vinod Chandra asks, what's your opinion? Has the COVID-19 pandemic in India after March 24th provided a big opportunity to hide the failures of the government and political governance, especially the removal of Article 370 from JNK, growing unemployment amongst young India, labor laws, education policy, etc.? I think a very short answer is possible. Either you say yes or no, I think, but what do you think? Has it provided an opportunity for the government to hide its own failures, Yamini?
It's given the government an excuse, but frankly, the government doesn't need excuses. It needs its politics to ask the hard questions. I think it's given the politics an opportunity to avoid asking the hard questions.
Good point, Pratap.
I agree that there was an opportunity. There is a lot of resentment, but it's not going to translate into political opposition to the government.
Yes. Well, that'll eliminate a question coming up asking what do you think of if public unrest with the failures of the government in handling COVID and the lockdown continue, will the government fall and who else can govern? I think we can drop that question since neither of you clearly think the government is going to be falling because of their failures on COVID. One question from Sibi Varghese is, we see that nothing can stop a government with an absolute brute majority. Do you think a revision in the constitution is required to bring about some checks and balances? How can we dissociate the system from the ruling party and get it to work for the nation? Pratap.
This one, I mean, look, you don't want to be writing a constitution right now in India. 90% of attempts at writing constitutions fail. We were fortunate that in the aftermath of the terrible tragedy of partition, we managed to put together really quite a remarkable constitution. I mean, you can't even debate, two basic policies in parliament. I mean, just imagine what a constituent assembly convened in India would look like now, right? So what we do need, I mean, I think this is one point we haven't touched on today, is that I think the biggest shock to most of us has not been what has happened in electoral politics. Those are cycles up and down. It's the extraordinary abdication of India's elite. In even the empowered elites in India, right, to, in a sense, let's put it this way, simply do their constitutional duty. And when the Supreme Court becomes more executive than the executive, right, the most pampered, protected, I mean, what will the government do to a Supreme Court judge? When the senior members of the bar, when senior academics, when frankly, Indian capital, right? I mean, in UPA days, they would all bring out manifestos, 5% growth, end of the world. You can't get 5 of them on the same platform when India has 3% growth pre-pandemic. So the idea of India, if it is being destroyed at all, and it's always true in societies, by the way, that it's elites that destroy their societies. Popular mobilizations can sometimes create convulsions, but they also self-correct. And I think one of the things to diagnose is what is it about India's elite at this moment that it has become so supine and cowardly in some ways. Are they true believers or are they simply fearful that we need a kind of Gandhi-like therapy to empower somebody? Because that's an easy path of resistance. If the Supreme Court just did 20% of its job, we would sleep slightly better at night, right? Democracy is about retrieval mistakes. We would have another chance. So that's one other area to work on.
Thank you, Pratap. Yamini?
I completely agree, and I think that what's really worrying about India is the Supreme Court, the media, private capital, the intellectual. There is at some level there's also an imagined veneer of fear that really that I think creates a form of self-censorship that is extremely damaging and dangerous. And until we are not able to address these, the spaces for contestation are going to shrink, and that's a very frightening thought.
Okay, I'm going to combine 2 questions into one to be the last question because we have 40 more that have come in. It's impossible to get to all of them. So these 2, one is Pradesh Chandran saying, how do you view the prospect of a right-wing single-party rule versus the idea of a coalition of many parties, which would be better for the country? And Parimal Alluri says, isn't it important now that more than ever before that India sees a strong, united political opposition develop? This is under the umbrella of the Indian National Congress to counter the religion-based narrative of the BJP. So basically variants of the same sort of question as we look to the immediate future of our politics. Yamini, perhaps you could go first and we let Pratap have the final word.
Sure. As we look to the future of our politics, I'm filled with deep skepticism because I'm not quite seeing where we talk about green shoots in our economy. I'm not quite sure where I'm seeing the green shoots in our politics. However, the Indian voter has an ability to surprise us often and an ability to use the power of the vote to really push our politics and ask important questions. So the hope rests in the Indian voter, and there is a vacuum, and I think that vacuum is filled with a sense of distrust, a sense of quiet protest, as I mentioned in the start of my remarks. If that can be leveraged, there is a lot of hope for this country.
Thanks, Yamini. Pratap.
Two quick things, and although it's the last word, it's certainly not the last laugh. I think, one, it's absolutely true that a robust India will be an India that takes everyone along. It's a India created through, in a sense, negotiation and inclusion, right? And to the extent that coalitions are an expression of that, right, sensibility, I think those are good things. But I think is that when we use the word coalition, we should not mean in the kind of traditional sense, pre-existing fault lines. And we just have to take everybody, along. As far as I think the opposition parties and stuff, there are two things. One, politics is also driven by events. And if one thing the pandemic has taught us is there will be more shock and surprise events. I think, frankly, we are looking at an economic scenario that's not very optimistic, maybe best case scenario, 4 to 5% growth average. But we are also in a very tough geopolitical situation. And it could be that there are these trigger events that actually finally call out the bluff of the BJP, that it is actually being able to deliver what it promises. The pandemic could have been one, but this is the opposition. The ingredients were not in place to take advantage of it. But there will be others. I mean, politics is in a sense about sensing that opportunity. And that also requires having a ear to the ground and deep grassroots presence. And, the BJP manages to kind of, tailor its messages so remarkably to different audiences when it senses what that, in a sense, anxiety is. So don't give up hope. You can't believe in politics if you think everything is predetermined. Then you might as well give up. But just make sure all the preconditions are there to take advantage of an opportunity when it comes up.
Thank you both. I should say, Pratap, there have been a lot of questions coming in, and I've crossed over 100 now, that relate specifically to some of your comments. A lot of people agree with you, some disagree. Professor S.K. Tapasvi says, does Dr. Mehta really think that democratic politics in India has no future? And if so, why? He has questioned that. I will say, Pratap, obviously I believe that the values, principles, and ideology of the Indian National Congress are indispensable for this country. And I also agree with you that we need to get our act together better and revive, particularly the grassroots organization for which we were famous. I mean, I would still argue that we have a nationwide presence second to none, not even to the BJP, by comparison with, for example, the relative lack of presence of the BJP in some parts of the South. Now in the Northeast, there seems to be wholesale taking over existing institutions of other parties. But otherwise, the Congress Party has historically had a presence in every village of the country for 70 years, and that's something we need to revive and strengthen. I want to say to both of you, you've given us some very stimulating ideas. To those who've been sending me messages urging me to respond, this isn't a debate between the Congress and thinkers. This is an opportunity in this platform for us to get the thoughts of people who are independent thinkers. Neither of them is here in order to promote our party interests, but we believe that hearing what they have to say and bringing the fruits of their extensive experience, reflection, and scholarship onto predicaments confronting all of us can only benefit us. We don't have to agree with everything they say. I do believe that democratic politics must have a future in India if India is to remain the India we've all loved and cherished. I do believe there is an ongoing battle for the soul of India, and that we are caught up on one side of that battle with the ruling dispensation having a very different idea of how they want this country to be. I think that those of us who have an involvement with the All India Professionals Congress should find these ideas stimulating enough to have further discussions in our chapters, in our state meetings, and even in the discussion that will follow behind closed doors after 5 o'clock with the fellows of the Professionals Congress. But with those words, let me thank Pratap and Yamini, Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Dr. Yamini Iyer, both fabulous public policy advocates, public intellectuals, and scholars, for having taken their time and trouble to share their thoughts with us. We've had a pretty decent audience, both on Zoom and more publicly on social media, on YouTube and other live channels. And I think we started a process or accentuated a process of reflection and discussion that's going to be very healthy for us. Let's pick up the threads and let's keep it going, folks. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Pratap. Thank you, Yamini. And with this, we bring the 3 webinars on society, economics, and politics to an end. Any thoughts, Salman Soz, before we wrap up this public segment of our national conclave?
No, I mean, just that this was a wonderful session. You can see the comments. It's been very stimulating. Lots of food for thought for us. And Shashi, you're absolutely right. This is not for us to have a debate on. It's just to listen to what others are saying. So for that, Pratap and Yamini, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
One comment, by the way, is it looks very simple listening to Pratap and Yamini. Why not ask them to head the party in 2024?
I saw that.
So you've got a new job opening, guys.
If I may share a joke I got this morning, somebody had printed a T-shirt that they were invited to McKinsey, and they were about to start a presentation. And they asked a question, has anybody here ever run anything, started a new business or something? And everybody said no. And they immediately said, my presentation is, I'm not the right person to ask. So.
Because you've not run for anything, but right. the time will come if Ravi Joshi, our participant, has his way. He wants you to come and put your theories into practice within the party. You'd be welcome. Thank you both very much. I'll ask Alim Javeri, who's been orchestrating all of this, to wrap up the session. And then I think we move into a closed door mode only for the fellows of AIPC. So once again, thank you to Pratap and Yamini, and to those of our previous panelists who stayed on. I think that Professor Ghotak has remained with us, and Dr. Vandana Shiva remained with us. Thank you very much for staying with us. And Alim, over to you to wrap up.
Thank you very much to our wonderful participants. Thank you, Chairman, for moderating such a wonderful session. To the AIPC fellows, we'd request you to please stay on. We will now begin our national convention. It's been a marathon day for all of us, but we thought we would make the most of it. In about 6 minutes, we will begin the national convention of AIPC. It's going to be about an hour and a half. There is going to be a town hall session at the end of this, at the tail end of the convention, so that you can have a direct conversation with the chairman and deputy chairman and national executive members of the AIPC. I'm going to request my colleague Alok to stop recording and to now stop the YouTube live as well, as the national convention is a closed door session for the AIPC fellows.